Good morning. We continue our review and summary of the conclusion of Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are on page 1455. Closer to the bottom of the page. Literally the last line, actually. We're by the last line on page 1455. And to sum up what we learned is we've now entered into discussion what happens to the soul when it comes down into this dark world, meaning into a body, into animal soul, into a physical world with all its concealments, to the point that even though the neshama remains be'etzem mahusa, its very core personality, divine, as he made it very clear earlier in the page, top half of the page, and also throughout throughout Ayin Beis many places, yet it needs siyua, it needs support. So yes, it comes from the Riyah vision. It comes from the etzem koyach hariyah, which fundamentally a mashpia, a mo'ir, that is able to see, but once it comes into the physical eye, it needs an outside light in a dark room or a dark environment in order to see. The same thing, the neshama needs siyua, needs the help of the malachim and all the other support to help the neshama see the way and find its way in this world. Yes, the neshama itself does the work, and there's only support, but it needs support. So the neshama is affected by this darkness in this world. So he said that the darkness, on the contrary, actually brings out the deepest faculties, the keches atzmim, he called it, from the neshama as it's rooted in atzmus. And that's what we've begun explaining. He's be it inyan in this new paragraph, based on the verse Shcheda ani v'nova. I am dark but beautiful. And he says this is the neshama lamata speaking to the neshama lamailo, meaning the neshama as is down below, as he says, Sheshcheda ani machmas haguf v'nefesh haba mishamaylam al eir Hashem v'kedushasei. I am dark due to the body and animal soul that conceal on the divine light and holiness within me. Nevertheless, know that I'm beautiful. So he began to explain. This is now going to be a good 7 pages of discussion, different parts of it. He began to explain what is the Bnei Yerushalayim. He's beginning first to talk about the neshama as it is Lamaila. So he's explaining what is Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is the name given by Shem and Avram, or the order in the Midrash is the other way around. Avram called it Yirah, and Shem called it Shalom. So the Eibishter said, I will join those two together and call it Yerushalayim, which in Aveda is Yirah Shalom, complete, full reverence, we called it, complete awe. And he explained what that means. There's 2 levels of Yirah. There's Yirah Tata, which is Bitla Yesh. It's Bitla, it's Yirah. But it's Bitla Yesh. And there's Yirah Allah, is Bitla Mitzi, is Bitla Betachlis. So Yirah Shalom, Yesh Lema, he says, is Yirah Allah. And what's the contrast? An Ava, it's Yesh Misha Oyev. Ava is all about connection. You love something, you're drawn to it. It's called a yesh that loves. It's a yesh Mitzias. Kol inyan Ava is desiring the gili to be close, that God's closeness should be revealed in us. That means you have a taste in it, and you desire it. So there's an entity that's desiring all of this. He wants something. That's called a yesh. Mashenkin in Yarir, he doesn't want anything. The year is the exact opposite. It's losing yourself in the presence of something beyond you. Bitl etz muhusei. Now, in that itself, there's bitla yesh, there's a yesh mishiyare, and then that's Yirah Tata, and then there's bitla mitzias Yirah Allah. So this is, now, when Avram called Yirah, he meant also he meant primarily, this is where God appeared, where he saw him. So he explains that Riyah and Yirah are connected. Why? Because When you see, not just hear about it, not just from a distance, but you see it with your own eyes, so to speak, that the perception is so clear, like as if you're seeing it, that's what creates the bittul mitzias. And you see that. If you hear about a great Rebbe, or havdil, something beautiful in nature, yeah, it could affect you and be inspired by it, but when you see it, you lose yourself in the presence of that. And that's Yirah connected to Chochmah, which is connected to Riyah, and that's Yirah Chochmah shebechinas Riyah. And then he brought in the parentheses a little Kabbalistic interpretation, because the Matnas Kohuna, like we learned, says Yirah is the same gematria as Yiru, Yud Reish Vav, which is 216. And he said, you do it the Shem Ab Hu Reish Yud Vav. I didn't look up yet. Reish Yud Vav Esis, 216 letters. And Gvura, which is Yirah, is also gematria Reish Yud Vav. Okay. And finally, V'zeyin Shleimus HaYirah, and this is what means Yirah Shalom, Yerushalayim, Shleimus HaYirah, complete awe or reverence, B'chinas HaBitl, Mitzias, Habo Meb'chinas Riyas HaMahuz Dalakus, coming from this perception of Riyah. And we discussed Riyah in a number of ways, and of course there are many levels in it. And here we'll continue now from the last line, where he's now going to bring it back, because remember, it's still all part of the bigger discussion. What is Yerushalayim? What is B'nai Yerushalayim? That's the neshama above. And then, of course, the neshama below, speaking to that, to the shadish of the root of the neshama above, which we'll get to. So last line on page 1455, we'll continue learning now. And this can be found, that the pages can be seen if you want to follow the text at ayinbeis.com. So he says like this, V'hine, and now, B'nivroim lo yesh b'chinas ha'yirah b'shleimus. This Yirah Shalom that we're talking about by Nivroim, meaning creations of existence, they do not have this Yirah b'shleimus. Sharigam ala malachim. Even the malachim, the angels that don't have a body and are not affected by the concealments of this world. Nemar u'b'malachim yasim tehillah. Next page, 1456. So you see, I need to pray. Tehillah is like a prayer for Yasim Tehillah. They need. How does they translate Tehillah? Praise. But what he's interpreting is that they need something, because that with mipnei she'ein hayirah etzlam b'shleimus. So therefore, they're capable. They need support. I don't want to use the word support, we'll confuse it with the support of the neshamas, but they need to be elevated, because they don't have Yirah b'shleimus, because they're Nevroim. Yes, high-level Nevroim, sublime, and they don't have the concealments, as I said, of this choshech of this world, but their Yirah is not b'shleimus. Like if you may recall back on, back on top of page 1454, he said that that even though they everything is rooted in Atzilus, but they're still Nevroim. Malachim, because their place is in Bria. They are creations at the end of the day. They're spiritual creations, but they are creations. So that's because in them is not radiating the Gili Mahus of Atzilus like the Neshama has. Now, of course, the Neshama comes down and it's more concealed, but the Mahus of Atzilus is still the very personality of the Neshama, whereas Malachim don't have that. Kamoshi is boyer. So this is going to be explained further as well. So that's even Malachim. But Kol Shkem b'Nivroim, and definitely Nivroim that have a body, a physical body. Shaguf shalehem medal yisedus, where Nivroim, their very body, is made up of the four elements: fire, wind, water, and earth. So for sure, that causes that they cannot have that bittul b'mitzias of Yirah, of Shleimus HaYirah. That is Nevroim. Omnom, b'bchinas Yerushalayim. But when you talk about Yerushalayim, which is higher than just a regular Nevroim, shehi b'chinas Malchus de Kedusha, which in the spheres is Malchus of Kedusha, shehi b'chinas alakus mamish. And he's going to say this is because it's Malchus of Atzilus, which is mamish alakus, iyu v'chayu echad, iyu v'gamu echad, shomu shleimus hayirah. So bottom line is, once something becomes a creation, you could ask her of it bittul hayesh, but the bittul mitziyas that we talked about, bittul betachlis, shleimus hayirah, is dafk Yerushalayim. V'hainu, b'bchinas hamalchus k'moishi ba'atzilus. It's referring to Malchus the way it is in Atzilus. The ba'atzilus meir mehus alakus, and the Atzilus radiates mehus alakus. Now remember, Atzilus is a structured world, but what dominates there is completely what the godliness of it all. So even though there's Chachma and Bina and Das, but it's basically godly Chachma, godly Bina. In Bria, the Chachma, Bina, and the Sphere is beginning to take their own identity. They still are dedicated to God, obviously, but it's already an entity. You could say an entity that's dedicated to God, not a pure Markava, which is a complete vehicle and a transparent channel, as we've learned a number of places earlier. V'hainu, and what this means, he's now spelling it out in the higher, with terminology from Seder Shtalshlus, the ha'oris hakav, shemer ba'atzilus, that the kav, the reflection of the kav, remember the kav is the main line that brings the energy from before the tzimtzum into the cholol, the space after the tzimtzum. And that is what shapes and creates all of existence. And it says in a number of places that the kav, a reflection of the kav radiates in Atzilus. In Bria, it's already a reflection of a reflection because it goes through the parsa, the partition. So since the kav meir b'Atzilus, who bechinas gila mehus, b'chlolos elam Atzilus. That's why in Atzilus, which is still connected to that kav, the order of the kav, that the Gilead Malchus of Elikus radiates there. Gam b'bchinas Malchus. Also, even in Malchus, even the lowest sphere of Atzilus still has that effect of the Ha'aras HaKav, the Gilead Malchus of Elikus. And now he refers to another statement which we've also learned, and I'll explain it. Shezeh inyan abba ilah mekanano ba'Atzilus. So in Tikkun Zeyar, there's a statement that says that even though all the four worlds, Atzilus, Bri, Yetzirah, Asiya, have all 10 spheres, yet in each world, what dominates, what's prominent, is one level of these spheres. Abba, Chochmah, is Mekanana, is nested in Atzilus. Bina, or the way expression is, Mekano b'kursaya, but Bria is Mekano Bina is Mekano b'kursaya. Kursaya is the world of Kisei, Bria. So there Bina is what dominates. Zah, Mides, is Mekano is nested in Yetzirah, and Malchus is nested in Asiya. So even though there's a Malchus in Atzilus, but it's under the aura, if you wish, the effect of Chochmah. That's why there's such level of bittul. So even though there is Chochmah in each of the four worlds, but here we're talking about the dominance of Chochmah in Atzilus. Ubederech klal, this is also something we learned. Remember, two levels of Malchus. Malchus, Pnimius HaMalchus and Chetzenius HaMalchus, which really starts associating with Bria. Because remember, Malchus of Atzilus will be the bridge that will draw down the energy after the parsa, the partition, into Bria. Says so b'derech klal b'chinas hamalchus kameshi b'atzilus hu b'chinas pnimius hamalchus. In general, just spelling out this level to be very exact. In general, when malchus and atzilus, it's pnimius hamalchus. Why is it in general? Because obviously, when you really break it down, there's chetzenius hamalchus in the pnimius hamalchus also within atzilus. But generally speaking, before Malchus goes into Biyah, waits, and Atzilus is Pnimius HaMalchus. Valkain. And that's why there, Yerushalayim. So now, what has he added here? Yerushalayim is the level of Malchus of Atzilus, Pnimius HaMalchus in the parentheses he adds. Malchus of Atzilus, which there is under the Mahus of Elikus, what he calls the Hara of the Kav, as well as Chochmah or Abba Mekanna B'Atzilus. Valkain Shoma B'China Shleima Seyira. So in contrast to the Nevroim, which already is a lower level in Bria, which does not have Shleima Seyira, here in Yerushalayim and Malchus of Atzilus, there is Shleima Seyira, complete reverence that we've been talking about before, the Bittul B'Mitzias. Okay, let me stop. But the next section he's going to start speaking about Benois. So what means the daughters of Yerushalayim? We'll get to that in a moment. Any questions about what we've learned this last section now?
I have a question. I'm sorry, I always seem to be the first one, maybe the only one. But so he was saying the Malachim, and forgive me,
Because you're the only one that processes, or you just happen to have questions?
I could offer some more flattering reasons, but that would be egotistical. Anyways,
Go ahead.
he says that just at the beginning, the last sentence of last page, and the first sentence of the first page, he seems to be saying that the Malachim can't have the same type of Yirah b'Shleimus because they're Nivraim. But so are we. And I understand his point is that our neshamas are rooted in Atzilus, and yes, everything, every creation does have some connection to Atzilus, but we are, because of our neshamas, are more, how to say, more, I don't know, more rooted in Atzilus.
When you said so are we, that's the neshamas lamata, which say shcheirani, we're darkened.
Yes, I get it.
Yerushalayim. He's talking here, the neshamas b'sharsha in their root, not the
I get
neshamas
it.
below.
I haven't asked my question yet. I was just trying to.
Did. I thought you said. He said that. So are we? You said. So I'm just explaining. We're not like the malachim. Bnei Yerushalayim is Atzilus. Malachim are in Bria. Just pointing that out. Go ahead.
So I totally get that distinction, but we are Nivarim and so are Malachim.
Who's we? When you say we, the neshama down on earth, or not Atzilus?
Well, I thought it's referring to both.
No, it's not. He says here, if you remember, that Shcheira Niva Nova is what the neshamas below are saying to their root in Atzilus, and the neshamas above. So the neshamas above are Bnei Yerushalayim. The neshama below is in a state of Shcheirani, a darkened state.
I see. So in our root, we're higher than Malachim, but down below, we don't. But is this to suggest that, but 1 second, you're saying, or you're implying that we can't have Yirah b'Shleimus?
He didn't finish the subject. He's just beginning. He started a big statement. He said, the neshamas below say to the neshama in its root, we are dark because of being in this world,
right?
But we're beautiful. So he's explaining who is this level that they're speaking to, Bnei Yerushalayim, the root. And he's just beginning. He didn't get back to the neshamas below. He's talking about the neshamas above and Atzilus now.
I see. Okay,
You're
so maybe I was
too much again.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I probably was. All right, thank you for.
It's in the middle of the discussion. He's in the middle of it. Right now, we're talking about Yerushalayim and the neshamas above, not the neshamas below.
I see. Okay, thank you very much for the clarification.
Okay.
I have a question. We long before we were talking about Mikra, Mishnah, and Nihi. This is somehow correlate to these levels.
I don't know. It would be too complex for me to figure that out right now.
Okay.
What's missing here that you want to make that correlation?
I tried to connect some kind of knowledge and integrate it to what we are doing right now. That's it.
Well, there he's talked about Torah, the 3 levels and the 3 worlds.
Yes.
I wouldn't bring that into this right now.
Okay.
Okay. Now, v'hanashamas k'may she'en l'mayla. And the souls as they are above, the b'chinas Atzilus, as they are in Atzilus, nikrois b'nei Yerushalayim. They're called the daughters of Jerusalem. Shem gamken b'chinas shleim Yirah. So Yerushalayim is the city, or in this case, Malchus of Atzilus. B'nei Yerushalayim are referring to the neshamas that reside, so to speak, in Malchus of Atzilus. So they're also a level of Shleim Yirah. That's why they're called the daughters of Yerushalayim. Va'ikirhu, so some of this is going to be a little cryptic and Kabbalistic. I'll try to explain it as best to my ability. Va'ikirhu b'neshama shem b'chinas ibur b'malchus. And this level, B'nai Yerushalayim, is primarily talking about the neshamas that are still in a state of gestation, we call pregnancy in Malchus, meaning they were not yet produced and nimshach into Bria. So obviously this is all metaphorical, but the idea is that the neshamas are conceived in Atzilus, even though b'sheir Shoshem they're rooted higher, but in Atzilus they become an entity, but it's an entity of B'nai Yerushalayim, and primarily it's still a state of Ibur and Malchus, because Malchus, remember, is the feminine, so things are still in the Ibur. When the neshamas will come from Malchus of Atzilus into Bria, that will be called a birthing, that they're like birth, and they begin to take on a separate identity, but they are in this state, B'nai Yerushalayim, they're still in state of Ibur, which means they're just like a child, is Ubar Yerech Imay. A child is like a rib of its mother. It's a piece of the mother. It's not considered a separate life. It's considered a life, but it's still considered an extension of the mother. So the same idea, the neshamas here are still an extension of Malchus of Atzilus. Ukidua sheyesh ibur v'leida. As it's known, there's two levels: ibur and leida, the pregnant stage, and leida, the birth. The neshamas. There's a level up. Sorry, I should have said. There's b'chinas ibur v'leida b'neshamas. That neshamas themselves, there's also two stages. Not just when a child is born physically, but the neshamas also go through ibur and leida. The b'chinas ibur hiklulu miuchedes b'chinas hamalchus. When it's in a state of ibur, the neshamas, it's encompassed and one with malchus, and within malchus. U'kamayel derech mashla ubur bebet na'im. Like we say, like the ubar, a fetus, within the womb of the mother, or the hari omrei ubar yerechimai, like I just cited. It's a ubar yerechimai. Yerech is like a rib or like an organ of the mother, so it's an extension. Hu ke'echad me'evreha misachadima. It's considered like one of her limbs, and which is united with her, just like all her limbs. The child is not yet an independent entity, only after the child emerges in birth. And it also says, V'gam amru, Chazal, our sages also say, Shavlad b'mei imei, oichel ma she'imei echeles, that the child in its mother's womb eats what its mother eats. So in other words, it doesn't eat on its own, not a separate entity. Whatever its mother eats, ultimately, in some way, is transferred over to the fetus. But after the child, after the soul is born, or this, after the child is born, the Yetzela Avira Elam, and comes out into the Avira Elam is basically the atmosphere of this world, outside of the mother's womb. It gets separate from the mother, and becomes a separate creation, a separate entity, no longer a limb of something of the mother, but a separate bria. That is not bound and you could say contained or held on to by the mother. So till in Ibur, yes, there can be a fully developed child, but it's all part of the mother and encompassed within her, as we said, a part like one of her limbs. In birth, it becomes a separate entity. That's the mashal. What's the nimshal in neshamas? And just as it is, pregnancy and birth on a physical level, so too it is with souls. When they're in a state of gestation or pregnancy, the neshama is encompassed on one. Now he calls it primis hakelim. Before he said Malchus or primis hamalchus, now he says primis hakelim of Malchus. The b'chinas sisartus mamish u'kamoi davar echad. Utterly united, like a fetus in a mother's womb, like one thing, like the limbs of a person in the muscle. The gam oichel, mashe'ima yechelis. And in that stage, the neshama, how do you apply that muscle that it eats what its mother eats? So he says, the hainu shebechinas ha'aras hakav, going back to the ha'aras hakav, the reflection of the very kav, which radiates in Atzilus, shemeir be'eses spheres Atzilus, that radiates in the 10 spheres of Atzilus, including Malchus, meir gamba neshama, it also extends into neshama. So when you say the mother eats, here you're talking about, so in Atzilus, where is it receiving its sustenance? From the order of the kav. Since the neshamas are in a state of ibur, they're eating what their mother eats. Basically, they're also being sustained by the order of the kav within the pnimis hakelim of Malchus of Atzilus. So radiates also by neshama shehi nizonos gamkem be'esei ha'oiv agili. It too is sustained and nourished by that very light and revelation of the reflection of the kav that radiates within the 10 spheres of Atzilus. That's ibur. What about Leda? The Leda sanashamas and the birthing of the souls, husanasas b'bchinas b'riya b'fnei atzmei. That's another stage. So he's really describing the actual process of how neshamas become entities. Because remember, the neshamas are rooted in very high levels, but then they go through a Atzilus. And now, the birth of the souls, that's it, become a bria b'fnei atzmei, like a child that is now a separate entity. B'bchinas mahusam etzias davar, becomes now a personality and an existing entity, b'meichin u'midas, with intellect and emotions of its own. Now, and that meichin and midas is lahasig elakus, to comprehend and understand godliness. V'hi b'bchinas neshama elikis. So even when it becomes a separate entity, it's still a neshama elikis. It's still called a divine soul, but it's a divine soul now that's not part of Atzilus. It's now become a separate entity to comprehend, understand godliness. Avol hi yotza v'nifrada mebchinas malchus. And here he used the expression I cited, I think, the other day, yesterday or 2 days ago, from Ageres HaKedah Simon Chof. I said that he didn't quite quote it, but it seemed very much when he was speaking how the neshama becomes a separate entity. I'm just looking back on page 1455. Okay, I have to find the exact language, but here he says clearly. So now it becomes separate, just like the child that emerges from the womb, the neshama, as it emerges from the womb of Malchus of Atzilus, it becomes yotzav nifrada. That's a very key word because, like he said, the child has become separate. Mebchinas Malchus, from Malchus, kamoi havlat shenivdal meimei, like the newborn child that's separate from its mother. V'hainu, the gam neshamas Atzilus harihim meruchak min akav. That's what I was referring to. That language at the end of the paragraph, at the top of page 1455, when he said the neshamas are meruchak ma'akav. So I remember I explained then, what does that mean? Because in Atzilus, they are receiving a direct line, like the fetus is fed and sustained from the order of kav of the kav in Atzilus. But now they're meruchakim in akav. So he's referring to that same language, which is why they need the siyua, like we said earlier. So meruchakim in akav, And here he spells out exactly the source is in Tanya, Geras HaKedesh, section 4, epistle, the 20th section there. Shekvar Yotzu v'nifredu ma'kelim, that's the language there, because the neshamas already have separated. Yotzu, they have left. That's the expression. They have so-called exited and separated from the kelim. Shebehem meir akav meir ein sof baruch hu. The kelim, which in them radiates the kav from Eid Ein Sof Baruch Hu, but that's the kelim of Malchus of Atzilus. The neshama says they come into Biyah, into Bria, now have become a separate entity. So they originate from there. And they still have it in their DNA, so to speak. But now they become the second stage, called birth. So let me correct myself. He's saying here two stages. One is they become separate, and surely when they become part of the world of Bria. So essentially there's the birthing that comes out of Malchus of Atzilus, but it's not become Bria yet. And then there's the way the neshama becomes an Elam HaBria. Doesn't explain the difference, but it's basically two stages as it emerges from the womb of Atzilus, Malchus of Atzilus, and then becomes Nasir Elam HaBria. So therefore, sure, it's a separate entity, because now it's an Elam HaBria. But obviously, the neshama is not like a malach and not like other creations, as we learned earlier, because it retains the divine personality. That's why it has the power to transform this world. But we'll get to that later. Right now, he's explained the dynamics of Bnei Yerushalayim, which he called was especially the state of Ibur, and then as it becomes separate. So interesting, Bnei is the daughters. But based on what he's saying is primarily when they're still in the state of Ibur in Yerushalayim. They're still like in the state of, in the womb. Like he said before, Iker, Shem B'chinas Ibur b'Malchus. And then comes the stage of Leda, the birth. And the neshamas are coming now separate entities, which is critical. Because if the neshamas are to come down to this world and do their work, if they remain in the state of the gestation stage, if they remain within the womb of Atzilus, they're not going to be able to come to this world and do what they have to do. So that's why Yotzu v'nifredu is what the Alter Rebbe says about the neshamas, that they exit, so to speak, and they separate, so they become independent entities that have a divine personality, but it's now also concealed, as we have learned, and we will learn much more at length. Because now he's going to go into whole arichas and discussion of what is the difference between Atzilus and Bria. But let me stop here for a moment and just get any questions if anybody wants to ask anything. So you see, it's a slowly developing concept, and that's why I would suggest before, I mean, you could ask any question, but he hasn't finished, obviously. He's slowly building it up to come back to then say what the neshamas below say to the neshamas above. Basically, the neshama in the lower levels speaking to Bnei Yerushalayim in the higher levels of Atzilus. And the purpose of that. So we're going to get to that in a while from now. I see that's probably another 2 pages before he gets back to Shcheirani. That's what it looks like to me. Now it's going to be a longer discussion. Any questions? Okay. Inyan hu. Here's the inyan in this. Shari yesh hefresh ben Atzilus leBria. There's a difference between Atzilus and Bria. These two worlds, 2 dimensions. Gam lebchinas Atzilus shebabria. Remember, all the worlds are encompassed in each other. So there's a level of Atzilus in Bria, but Atzilus on its own is higher than Bria, even compared to the Atzilus within Bria. This is a common concept in Chassidus, that everything is biskalus. It's like saying there's a difference between Chochmah and Bina, even compared to the Chochmah within Bina. Or there's a difference between Moichin and Midas, even compared to the Moichin within Midas. So every level has the others. We're going to soon be counting the Omer. And we're going to say it every day. Chesed sheba chesed, Gvura sheba chesed. So is there a difference between Chesed and Gvura? Of course. Is there a difference between Chesed and Chesed sheba Gvura? Absolutely. They have something in common because it's called Chesed Shebegvura. But he wants to say that there's a difference between Atzilus and Bria, even compared to the Atzilus within Bria. Shari yesh mosach mavdil. There's a separated partition or curtain. We learned about the parsa as a partition. Sometimes the word is mosach. Mosach in Hebrew is like a curtain. Mavdil, that separates ben Atzilus leBria. So that tells you clearly it's two different levels. Like we say in the Beis Hamikdash or the Mishkan, Kodesh Kodashim. Then there was a mosach, a curtain, that's separated from Kodesh. That's separated from the next level, from the Oyel Moed. So these curtains represent a shift, qualitative shift of spiritual intensity. V'akav, hanimshach be'eid ein sof, the kav that we talked about, the main, we'll call it the main line of energy that flows from eid ein sof, meir b'chol elam ha'atzilus ad parsa. It radiates, at least a reflection of it, in all of Atzilus. So if you want to know what makes Atzilus is because the kav is radiating there, ada parsa, and it radiates until this parsa. Parsa and mosach here are interchangeable. Until this curtain, like the Kodesh Kodashim, until the curtain that separates it from the next section, it's Holy of Holies, every inch of it. V'sham istayim ha'oir. This is quoting. This is from Eitz Chaim. The Alter Rebbe's Geras HaKedesh Simachov talks about it. When they ask, till where does the kav? We know the kav does not go down all the way in the chol and mokum panim, in that space. It only goes down. So the question is asked: where does the kav end? So there's a longer discussion on this. I'm not going to go through all the details, but briefly, there's the kav, and then there's still a reflection of the kav. So the kav, essentially, he says, mistayim ha'oyer, till the parsa, basically after Malchus of Atzilus, the eina meir beBria, and does not radiate in Bria, mepnei ha'parsa mafsekes, due to the separating curtain. So it's like literally a curtain, just like a physical curtain. So the sunlight is coming through your window, but you want to somewhat diffuse it, so you put a curtain. So even though you can get sunlight through the curtain as well, but that's not the original light. So he's saying basically the kav is nimshach nistayim till the end of Atzilus, the parsa, and from there on, the parsa is essentially mafsik, separates and the light does not shine through into Bria. But we know that the kav, that Bria exists. So where is it getting its energy from? He's not saying it completely stops. So he answers, Umasha meir derech haparsa, what does radiate, what does shine through the curtain, the partition, harizeh b'chinas ha'ara de ha'ara. It's a reflection of a reflection. So obviously there are levels. You could have the direct sunlight, you could have sunlight that is somewhat diffused, and then you could have a real curtain that causes it to be a reflection of a reflection. Shehi ha'ara nivdelis. It's called a separate ha'ara. Like we said before about birthing. So it's a reflection, but because it's doesn't retain the intensity of the original, it's called nivdelis. Now, obviously, when it comes to light, if you really separate the light from its source, there will be no light. So it still has to be, if the sun were to stop at night, nothing's coming through the curtain. So you still need a connection between the sun and the sunlight and the light that comes through the curtain. But it's called nivdelis because conceptually it's now taken a leap, and the curtain has so-called changed its personality to some extent. Because it's relatively infinitely distant from the etzem ha'or. Now, with real light, sunlight, it's hard to fully understand that, because you'll say, how different is already the light coming in through the curtain in my house than the light outside of the curtain. But when you think of it, let's say with a teacher and a student, where a teacher has a very high-level student, we'll call like a student from Atzilus. So the teacher can convey the ideas very straightforward, direct, the student understands it. But then comes a student, let's say from the level of Bria, the teacher has to now put it in, give examples, mishalim, and has to take the idea and diminish it, conceal it, can't say it all. So you see there's a qualitative shift. It's not just a matter of less light, more light. And that's what's called Ayin Beis, because it's taken a leap. And the parsa is what creates that, that's the partition, that's the boundary. That Atkan Atzilus, where the Kav radiates, and now it's Ha'ara of Ha'ara, what he calls a separate Ha'ara. So this is like we'll call it the Kabbalistic and Hasidic terminology for what he said before was Leda, when the child becomes separate from its mother. And this is what he's coming to explain, the difference in Atzilus and Bria. Okay. And he continues to analyze this, continues to explain it. And also the fact that it's radiating, and even the fact that it's radiating light, that after all, lehedya means the light does ultimately, after all, shine there, because the light so-called pierces the curtain. As I said before, the curtain doesn't shut off the light. It's not opaque curtain where you literally cannot see it. You know, there are curtains that you put them up and the room becomes completely pitch black. Here, that's not the case. So though it is a curtain, but the curtain is pierced by the light, and that level is called Atzilus Shebabriya. That's what he was referring to. Because it still has the light of Atzilus, but it's how it is in Briya after the Parsa. So he wants to talk now about that light. So seemingly that light still has an Atzilus element to it. So you're going to explain it. So again, I need to explain this. These are all Kabbalistic terms. So the way Kabbalah explains it in Eitz Chaim, and again, the Alter Rebbe, I think in Simon, again, Geras HaKedah, Simon Chaf, he quotes this text is from there. So when he describes there, how does it move from the Kalim of Malchus of Atzilus into Biyah? So he says, the expression is that the Kalim, the 30 Kalim of Malchus of Atzilus, they become Naran, Nefesh Ruach Neshama LeBiyah. So it's not a complete cutoff. Even though Bria, as we said here, is a different reality. It's a different domain than Atzilus. But they're not completely two separate entities. Bria is receiving from Atzilus. When Malchus is mashpia, when the teacher teaches the example I gave, even to a beginner student, it's still the teacher communicating with him. It's just he's communicating to a far lower level than as opposed to a student that's closer to the teacher's level. So what that's called in Kabbalistic language is that the Kalim of Malchus of Atzilus become the Nefesh, Ruach Neshama of Biyah. Shezeu b'chinas elikus, the Atzilus. That means that's the Atzilus within Bria. So it originates from Malchus of the Kalim of Malchus. There's a parsa that separates, but then there's a light that shines after the parsa, which we already said is a Arin of Delis. It's separate, but it still retains certain elements of Atzilus. And that's what's called, that it becomes Naran, the Naran of Biyah, Nefesh Ruach Neshama of Biyah, is coming from the Kalim of Malchus of Atzilus. Umavur by Geras HaKedah Sham, yeah. So he's actually analyzing the Geras and explaining the Geras HaKedah, the one we mentioned before, 20. Shemeir behem gam erakav. So that the Alter Rebbe adds that in the Kalim, in the Naran of Biyah, you also have the Kav. B'kol Mokim, nevertheless, it's not a contradiction to what we said. You cannot compare it. It's not the Eirakav the way it's in Atzilus, pre the curtain and partition. Like we learned earlier, like it was explained earlier, Dibra Masko, this goes back to middle of volume 2. The Kalim Atzilus Commission Nimshachim B'Biyah Nasim. So that when the kelim of Atzilus, the way they are transmitted into Biyah, the kelim become more dominant and more abundant, and the Oyer becomes less. Again, exactly the example. What happens when a teacher is coming down to a much lower level? So the Oyer that he's transmitting is far more diminished, and the kelim that he's presenting are far more abundant because he needs to bring it into kelim. For a higher level student, you don't need that many words. You don't need that much explanation. You need something, but not quite the same. So basically, if you want a formula of how Ishtalshalus works, the lower you go, the kelim become more prominent and the Oyer becomes less. The higher you go, the Oyer is more dominant and prominent and the kelim are less. That's a general rule of how Ishtalshalus works, which makes total sense. When the energy is very intense, the kelim are very small. When the energy becomes lesser, the kelim become bigger. And they're interdependent, obviously. And that's how, think of it, I always give the example, we're talking here the example of fetus, of pregnancy and birth. It's an excellent example as well. Upon conception, there's almost no kelim. It's all concentrated in one cell that's been conceived, and then the cell begins to what? Split. Split means kelim. 2 cells, 4 cells, 8, 16. Then you have a child with 35 trillion or 75 trillion, up to 35, between 35 and 75 trillion cells, with an entire structure, with limbs and organs. And you could actually see that. Today there are images that describe, you see the first, second, and third trimester of pregnancy. You can literally see that. So you see Eris manifesting in kelim, and kelim are becoming more dominant, and the Oyer becomes less. I remember I was once at a conference, a Torah science conference in Florida. There's a big neuroscientist was there, and he said that when a child is born, you see in pregnancy, you see the head is much larger than a child after they're born. He says because for the child to come through the birth canal, it has to lose a big part of the neurons in its brain. So the brain actually shrinks. In other words, that's what he said. So I remember I spoke after. So I spoke after him. He even gave a number. I don't remember how many. It was a serious number. I don't remember what it was. Anyway, but after he spoke, I spoke after him. I said maybe that's the meaning of the Gemara that says in the mother's womb a child learns the whole Torah, and then upon birth it's made to forget. So in a sense, part of the conscious memory, at least, has diminished. And I remember he came over to me and said, that's excellent parallel. But the point being is that the Oyer becomes less as the kelim become more, and vice versa. Okay.
That sounds like a Yerida Tzarech Aliyah, just saying.
We're talking this stage right now, the way the birthing happens. Then comes our avodah. Our work is to retrace the steps and elevate the world back. But this is the stages that he's talking from Atzilus to Bria. And then he says to look afterwards in the same Hemshech of Maimer in volume 2, the Maimer Odom Kiyeh that talks about this. So bottom line is, what he said here was 2 points, 2 main points. Firstly, there's a difference between Atzilus and Bria, because in Atzilus the Kav itself radiates, and then there's the Parsa, where it stops, the partition, and what comes afterwards is a Order Nivdelis, a reflection of a reflection which is separate, and Ein Arech, and even that, no, 3 things actually. The first thing, that there's a Parsa and it separates, and the Kav stops there. Then he says, and what does radiate through the Parsa is only a Hara Nivdelis, and even that which pierces the Parsa, which means it's still bringing Atzilus into Bria, like the Kelim into the Naran of Bria, he says, but it's Ribia Kelim and Miyut Ha'er. So it's still not like it is in Atzilus. That's the difference between Atzilus, the first difference between Atzilus and Bria. And he's going to continue the next section. He's going to say there's also another difference. There's another difference between Atzilus and Bria. So all going to come to explain the difference between Bnei Yerushalayim as they are in Malchus, Yerushalayim, with the Shleimus Yirah, and why a neshama, once it comes down below, does not have that level of Shleimus Yirah, because it's being born and being separated, like you said, Yatsuv and Nifradu. Let me stop here for any questions. And there's more to go with Atzilus and Bria. Plenty more here, I see. It's going to talk a lot about the process of how neshamas travel, how the neshamas evolve from this higher level to the lower levels.
Rabbi Jacob said, sorry.
And of course, the goal is that once it comes down below, that the neshama, obviously through Avodah, as I said, retraces the steps and climbs back up. And then not only that, is going to have a Maila, even Legab and Bnei Yerushalayim. Keep in mind, the neshamas below, because of the darkness, is going to propel them, like we said, into a place that's much higher than the neshama says they are Lamaila. So that's going to be the end story. But meanwhile, he's now talking about the process first of the birthing, of coming down, before we go through that whole Avodah. Yeah, go ahead.
I remember, like, the first time we discussed this, it was a whole discussion of the parsa, just like you said, the curtain that doesn't block the light completely, but lets a little bit through. But my question, and I think I asked this before, but I'm not sure if we really got to the answer of it, was that, is it a one-way flow, number one? And if it is, like, there's let's say there's a level 7 intensity that the light shines through. But through our avoda, we know that we can elevate it, as you said, and create a higher light and reflect it back. So does that mean that parsa has a different level of intensity coming down versus going up?
It's not being discussed right now. Now we're talking about coming down. We're not talking about going up. If you really want to have understanding of that, you have to go back to volume 2, where he talks about how we go back up, which is by transforming the parsa.
Correct.
And the tzimtzum. It's a whole other thing.
Okay.
We're not talking about that. We're talking now the process of creation, how God creates existence. Then there's another process of how we transform existence and how we go back up, and how we even transform the curtain and the tzimtzum. That was the big question. How can a post-tzimtzum reality experience pre-tzimtzum consciousness?
Correct.
Or a post-parsa reality experience pre-parsa consciousness? But that's really a discussion of the connection of Atzilus and Biyah. Now he's talking about the separation. So now we're talking about the birthing of the child, the birthing of souls, how they come down below into a state of shcheirani, darkness, and then is the avodah that they're going to go back. But as I said, the Rebbe Rashab is doing it very methodically, step by step by step.
Thank you.
So we're going to discuss that at length. That's the ultimate, as I said, the end story. But it's not there right now.
From this point of view, I heard what you just said, that there are two different diminishing of the light. One is just filter, the partial just reduce the light. The second is the reflection, and reflection is a leap. It's not just a quality diminishing, it's a quantity diminishing. And when we do our avoida, we targeting that reflection, not the diminishing, I believe.
I don't know. That's not necessarily the case. But we'll talk about it when we get there.
Okay.
He's not discussing that right now.
I have a question, Rabbi. This is
Yeah.
it seems like literally I am dark, but I am beautiful because the light is just diminished. Is that specifically what they're talking about when he says shkorani?
We're going to go back. He's going to discuss it at length.
Okay.
He said what he said so far was due to the body, the soul is saying, due to my body, an animal soul that conceal on the divine light and its holiness, that it's a concealer. That's why it's dark. It's in a dark state. Yet I'm beautiful. That's what we've learned so far. Later, we're going to go back to that verse, and he's going to explain it in more detail. But yes, the answer is due to the concealment. Yeah. Okay. So we'll stop here. Close to around 36, around 10 lines from the bottom of page 1456. And as I say, he's going to continue to slowly build this whole picture to understand the shamas in Atzilus, the shamas in Biyah, which is, of course, extremely relevant to the whole theme of Ayin Beis, because the interface, we want to then create the interface. But first we have to create an existence. God has to first create a world that has a separate consciousness before we come to Hashem Echad, which teaches us how to unite that back with God, which is, of course, our Avodah, which we'll clearly get to. But now he's explaining how the process of the concealment works. Yeah. They said this will go till 1462. So we'll stop here, page 1456.